Hello and welcome to Décolonisation le Vietnam. Episode 4, The August Revolution. At the end of the last episode, we left off in the early 1930s. And today, we will cover the years between 1930 and 1945. And by the end of the episode, ladies and gentlemen, the independence of Vietnam will be declared not once, but twice. If you remember the last episode, what happened between 1930 and 1932 is that the French had reduced Vietnamese nationalism to zero. Firstly, they put back Bao Dai in his box after he asked for a constitution. And number two, they unleashed such a fierce repression that nationalist movements, communist or non-communist, were dismantled and in disarray. Therefore, in the 1930s, there was just no challenge to French Indochina from the inside. And in fact, the 1930s were a golden era for French Indochina, and it was la dolce vita for French colonists. If you lived in Saigon, for example, you could relax at the Cercle Sportif, have a stroll on the Rue Catina, and sip a cognac gaz at the Hotel Continental. On the Vietnamese side, all the leaders were dead, in prison, or in exile. Ho Chi Minh himself got busy with communist endeavors in Thailand and Malaysia, in part because he just couldn't get back to Vietnam. So strong was the French grip on the country. Of course, he smuggled letters and pamphlets under the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, but he could do nothing more. And nothing major happened in Vietnam in the 1930s if you think of struggle against the French. The only major event worth mentioning happened around 1936. There was a brief window when a progressive government came to power in France dubbed the Front Populaire. And by the way, this government, the Front Populaire, is talked about a lot these days in France, as the left has united to prevent the far right from taking power at the elections in late June. But I digress. The Front Populaire, or Popular Front, as it translates in English, was a broad left-wing coalition, and it embarked in France on a series of progressive reforms, such as the 2-week paid vacation. In the colonies, the Front Populaire did a lot of things, but in particular, it relaxed publishing laws, making it easier to publish new papers. So the Vietnamese nationalists were very hopeful that the Popular Front would finally implement social reforms and expand democratic institutions in Indochina. Among nationalists who started agitating was our friend Nguyen An Ninh, who had created a militant paper/political action group called La Lutte, the struggle. And La Lutte inspired other groups. The communists, for example, founded their paper in Hanoi, Le Travail, meaning labor, in which collaborated both the future military commander of the Communist Party, Vo Nguyen Giap, and Trong Chinh, the future Secretary General of the Communist Party. Other nationalists associated with the writer Nhat Linh's and his movement, the Literary Self-Strengthening Movement. And all these people started agitating as well. And to move forward with their demands, the Vietnamese took a leaf out of Gandhi and Nehru's book. Nguyen An Ninh and La Lutte allied with Bui Quang Cheu's constitutionalists, Nhat Linh's movement, and the communists, and all these people formed an Indo-Chinese Congress. However, the Viet Congress quickly discovered that there are limits to colonial democracy, as Christophe Gauchat puts it. And even the French leftists of the Front Populaire were not capable of the moderate political reforms advocated by the Congress. The French shut down the Congress in September 1936. And starting in 1937, many of the Congress leaders were incarcerated, including our friend Nguyen An Ninh. So apart from the Front Populaire window, things were going nicely for France in Indochina, and things could have continued for decades and decades. But something happened. You guessed it, 1940, when news of the French defeat against Germany hit the colony like a bolt from the blue. And immediately afterwards, Japan pounced on Indochina. The Japanese military occupied Indochina and made the French an offer they could not refuse. Okay, guys, we're happy to leave you at the wheel, but you better do as we say and provide us with all the raw materials we need. It's that, or we exterminate everybody. Capisci? So, from 1940 onwards, on paper, the French were still in power. They still ran the show and continued to victimize Vietnamese. But the French new clothes did not fool the native. Moreover, the Japanese brought Dutch and English coolies in Indochina to perform forced labor. And that sight of seeing white men being brutalized by Asians opened or finished to open Vietnamese eyes. The myth of the invincible white man was shattered for good. But things did not change immediately. From 1940 to 1945, the French governor, a guy called Decoux, rallied to the Vichy regime that was collaborating with the German and continued to collaborate with the Japanese until the 9th of March 1945. To give you some context, at that stage of World War II, the writing was on the wall for Japan. Defeat against the US was inevitable. So, with an Allied invasion of Indochina looming over their heads, the Japanese decided to prevent any uprising against them by neutralizing the French colonial forces. In one night, the Japanese army overran all military garrisons and took over all administrative buildings across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And this was done sometimes with the same brutality that Japan had shown in China. Think of the Nanjing Massacre, for example, in 1937. In Lang Son, at the Chinese border, for example, the Japanese soldiers beheaded the 100 or so French soldiers of the garrison. And that's why in one night, I repeat, overnight, all French officials were killed or put under arrest. The 80-year-old walls of the French building came tumbling down brutally and swiftly. So what did the Japanese do after having destroyed the French colonial empire? Well, they handed over the country on a platter to the Emperor Bao Dai, and on the 11th of March 1945, Bao Dai issued a declaration of independence prepared for him by the Japanese. The Empire of Viet Nam was born, and Bao Dai appointed a new Prime Minister, Tran Trong Kim. Mr. Kim was a scholar and a historian who actually had helped popularize the name Vietnam in the 1920s by publishing a history of Vietnam. So in March 1945, for the first time since 1802, Vietnam was theoretically free and unified under one emperor, Bao Dai. In reality, Japan was still pulling the strings, but Vietnam was independent. This could have been the end of the story, right? Yet, as you know, on September the 2nd, 1945, it was Ho Chi Minh who proclaimed the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So the question is, what happened? First explanation is that Bao Dai and Mr. Kim's governments were just not up to the task. Bao Dai's government, having received independence from the Japanese, could have asserted itself and could have written the new page that was starting. And after all, that's exactly what happened in other countries like Indonesia, where Sukarno embodied independence after having collaborated with the Japanese during World War II. But Mr. Kim's government was a government of scholars, of mandarins, of old-fashioned intellectuals who were imbued with a sense of intellectual superiority. Kim and his cabinet did not get their hands dirty, and they either forgot or were not competent enough to govern. And in a time where people were looking for vigorous leadership, Kim and Bao Dai did not ignite any enthusiasm whatsoever. And their most egregious failure was the failure to curb or even attempt to deal with the terrible famine that struck northern and central Vietnam between 1944 and 1945. This famine was a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. We're talking here about an estimated 1 million people dying of hunger. And this famine was rightly blamed on the French and of the Japanese who were hoarding the rice. But at the same time, the people criticized Bao Dai governments for their apathy in the face of this appalling disaster. By contrast, guess who was using the famine for its benefit? It was a movement we have not introduced yet, the Viet Minh. At this time, peasants were taking matters into their own hands, basically, by storming rice warehouses. The Viet Minh sent agents to lead these spontaneous revolts, and they conducted quote-unquote rice struggles. They went in front, broke open the granaries, and distributed the rice to the poor. And let's be clear, the Viet Minh didn't solve anything, but what mattered was the optics. The peasants were like, hey, at least these guys are with us, and this earned the Viet Minh a lot of support. So first explanation, to say it again, is that Bao Dai did not play his hand very well. He had a golden opportunity to get back into the game, he squandered it, and let Ho Chi Minh take the lead. Secondly, in hindsight, several events that happened during World War II played in favor of Ho Chi Minh and of the Viet Minh. The first one is that straight after the French defeat in 1940, there was a new communist uprising in the Nam Bo, the southern region that the French called Cochin China. This revolt was again ruthlessly crushed by the colonial administration. 100 communist cadres were executed, and more than 8,000 were thrown to jail, including late Xuan, who returned to Pulo Condor. The Communist Party was annihilated in the south, and what happened is that its center of gravity then moved to the north, towards Hanoi, therefore closer to where Ho Chi Minh was in China. And from Hanoi, a few young leaders made it to China, and through them, Ho Chi Minh opened up a link with the party in the northern part of Vietnam. And the second key event, as far as I'm concerned, during World War II, was the death of Nguyen An Ninh, who succumbed in prison in 1943. Ninh, with his aura, his charisma, and his activism since the 1920s, who knows, he might have been a competitor for Ho Chi Minh. In any case, his death left the field open for Ho Chi Minh. So it's now time to talk about Ho Chi Minh himself and see how he went from ordinary Comintern agent in Hong Kong in 1930 to father of Vietnamese independence in 1945. Being based in China before the war, Ho Chi Minh witnessed both the savage civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and Mao Communist, as well as the Japanese invasion of China. By 1937, the Japanese forces had captured Beijing and Shanghai. And that led to a change of strategy between communists and nationalists who had been fighting each other since 1927. In late 1936, the Comintern decided that the priority was now the fight against fascism and allowed Mao Zedong to form a united front with the Kuomintang against the Japanese invasion. And that was great news for Ho Chi Minh, because it allowed him to come out of hiding. He came back to town and immediately reactivated his network. And Ho Chi Minh had many friends in both camps. On the communist side, there was, for example, Zhao Enlai, a comrade of his since La Belle Époque of the 1920s in Paris. On the nationalist side, you had someone like Ho Hoc Lam, a Vietnamese serving in Chiang Kai-shek's staff and who was an alumnus of the Go East program established by Phan Boi Chau in the early 1920s. We talked about it in episode 3. And one of the consequences of the creation of the Chinese United Front was that the Chinese nationalist leaders pushed their Vietnamese allies to create a Vietnamese front modeled on the Chinese one. No sooner said than done. The VNQDD and all the nationalist parties on one hand, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnamese Communist Party, Indo-Chinese Communist Party on the other hand, were forced to enter an alliance. And it was, of course, uncomfortable for Ho Chi Minh. But on the upside, after the Japanese occupied Vietnam in 1940, the Chinese leaders, the Chinese generals, allowed Ho Chi Minh to return to Vietnam. Ho could not wait. He promised to launch armed resistance against the Japanese and to provide intelligence to Chinese nationalists. And that's how, in 1941, 30 years after leaving Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh set foot again on his homeland. And Ho Chi Minh took full advantage of the fact that he was now out of reach of his Chinese patrons. At the 8th plenum of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in Pak Bo in May 1941, he convinced the most radical Communist Party members to mute their Stalinist tendencies, to give priority to national liberation. And the translation of that is the creation of the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh, whose first Secretary General was Ho Chi Minh's communist comrade, Truong Chinh. Around Ho Chi Minh were also Pham Van Dong, whom we met in episode 4 when he joined the Youth Revolutionary League, and a young militant in his 30s whom we'll hear about a lot moving forward, Vo Nguyen Giap. And the creation of the Viet Minh was a very savvy move for Ho Chi Minh. If you think about it, the Viet Minh was the translation of the United Front in Vietnam, in the country. And because the other Vietnamese parties had stayed in China, Ho Chi Minh and the communists were free to run the show the way they wanted, without interference from their enemies and from the powerful Chinese generals. So Ho Chi Minh did two things. One, he said, no, the Viet Minh is a broad-based coalition of patriotic people to fight the French and the Japanese. Number two, he hid it very well, but he put communist members firmly in command of the Viet Minh. So, massive strategic error here from the other nationalist parties like the VNQDD or the Dong Minh Hoi League or the Dai Viet. By staying in exile in China, they left the communists free to do whatever they wanted on the ground with all the time in the world. Ho Chi Minh knew that his movement had no popular support yet. Think about it, the Communist Party had only about 5,000 members. But he took the opportunity afforded to him to prepare to seize power when the time came. The Viet Minh infiltrated all social and political structures. For example, it created a host of popular associations for national salvation, each covering one social group: women, teachers, peasants, youth, old people, etc. And these associations helped to rally masses and allowed communists to sink their roots in the whole Vietnamese society. Ho Chi Minh got to work, transforming the Viet Minh into the sole defender of the Vietnamese nationalism. In 1941, echoing Phan Boi Chau's letters from overseas, written in blood from 1907, and still using the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, Ho Chi Minh published a letter from overseas calling his compatriots not to, quote, be eternally slaves without a country, end quote. He crisscrossed the northern region of the country, which is a tiny piece of land where he could evade the French Sûreté and the Kempeitai, the Japanese secret police. And from there, Vietnamese forces launched modest but much trumpeted attacks against the Japanese forces. And since no other Vietnamese group dared to poke the Japanese bear, the Viet Minh daring attacks won them a lot of prestige, and young people from the country and from the cities started to join them in the mountains. In 1942, Ho Chi Minh traveled back to China for consultations, but he was arrested on suspicion of espionage for the Japanese and the French. He was incarcerated by a nationalist general and transferred from one prison to the other 18 times. And at this stage, he was presumed dead by his comrades within Vietnam. He was only released in 1943, and as soon as he was released, he traveled back to Vietnam. And some sources say that he was released especially so that he can help the Americans in Vietnam. You see, 1943 saw the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and that event led to a rapprochement between Stalin and Roosevelt in the fight against Hitler. Ho Chi Minh thought, hey, if the little father of the Soviet people were working with Roosevelt, surely I can work with the Americans too. So he got in touch with the precursor of the CIA. This is the organization called the OSS. He got in touch with them and offered to provide intelligence on the Japanese. In exchange, the Americans provided him with rudimentary military equipment for his forces and with American cigarettes that Ho smoked non-stop. And that is how the future People's Liberation Army led by Giap started. It was equipped and trained by American agents from the OSS. And Ho very cleverly exploited this connection to the United States and told everyone with ease that the Viet Minh had the backing of Uncle Sam. And this added again to the prestige of the Viet Minh. So, when the Japanese forces struck on the 9th of March 1945, unlike the other nationalists, Ho Chi Minh was in Vietnam. And after the French secret police disappeared overnight, his freedom of action increased. But he did not show his hand just yet. You see, Ho Chi Minh was a very savvy operator who had many qualities that Bao Dai lacked, for example. One quality was that Ho Chi Minh was an avid consumer of news and current affairs. This was a guy who listened religiously to the radio broadcasts in Russian, in French, in English, and Vietnamese. And he knew exactly where the international balance of power was. So as an astute observer of international events, Ho Chi Minh knew that an American victory was anything but certain. But he knew not to lash out before Japan had been completely defeated. So after the Japanese coup in March, instead of rushing to compete with Bao Dai, Ho Chi Minh just worked harder to make sure that when the American victory happened, the only potential partner in Vietnam would be the Viet Minh. On the ground, that meant three things: court the US, combat the Japanese, and infiltrate all parts of Vietnamese society. In May 1945, the Viet Minh transferred their headquarters from the far north to the edge of the Red River Delta, meaning not far from Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the 6 northern provinces as a liberated zone and issued a 10-point program, the first of which was chase the Japanese out. Then, in August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. And after that, Japan surrendered, of course, catching everybody off guard. You see, analysts had predicted that Japan would fight on until 1946 at least. So Ho Chi Minh too was caught off guard, and his Viet Minh machine was not completely ready. But the Viet Minh was more prepared than all of its competitors. Think about it. The nationalists were still in China waiting for Chiang Kai-shek's army to enter Indochina under the Potsdam Agreements. Number two, the French expeditionary force sent by de Gaulle to reclaim the colony was still at sea. And number three, Bao Dai's government and pro-Japanese nationalist groups in Indochina were in disarray now that the Japanese protectors have surrendered and downed tools. This was the long-awaited favorable opportunity that Ho Chi Minh was waiting for. And Ho Chi Minh seized it with both hands. He knew he had to act quickly because Ho Chi Minh was well aware of the decisions of the Potsdam Conference, which ended in August the 2nd. At that conference in Potsdam, the Allies had decided to entrust the Japanese surrender in Vietnam to the Chinese nationalist forces north of the 16th parallel and to the British forces south of that. The Chinese troops were therefore ready to enter Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh knew that they would bring back with them his nationalist enemies. As early as the 11th of August, the Viet Minh issued an order to people to rise up and seize power. At the same time, Vo Nguyen Giap led a detachment towards Hanoi, and peasants in the Tonkin and Annam region took over their villages under Viet Minh leadership. On August the 16th, 1945, Ho Chi Minh convened a national congress, and that congress adopted a mini constitution, an anthem, and a flag for Vietnam. And for the last time in his life, Ho Chi Minh used the alias Nguyen Ai Quoc to sign an address to the people. In the cities, as soon as Japan surrendered, euphoric rallies and spontaneous protests erupted everywhere and filled the power vacuum left by the Japanese surrender. Viet Minh agents moved swiftly to control these demonstrations. They brought flags, banners, slogans, and gave fiery speeches asking for support for the Viet Minh. And because all of these people were eager for leadership, they responded enthusiastically to the Viet Minh. On August 19th, taking advantage of the Japanese passivity, the Viet Minh agents led massive crowds in Hanoi and basically kicked out Bao Dai's sluggish administration out. I mean, these guys just led the crowd around town, occupied all strategic buildings, raised the Viet Minh flag, and voila, they were in power. It was like a tsunami, and there was no stopping the Viet Minh now. After Hanoi, Hue and Da Nang fell into Viet Minh hands on the 23rd, and Saigon fell on the 25th, even though the situation was much more chaotic over there. We'll talk about it at the next episode. And on the 30th of August, the Emperor Bao Dai abdicated by declaring, quote, "I would rather be a citizen of a free country than the emperor of a slave state," end quote. Beautiful. And after saying that, Bao Dai handed to the Viet Minh the symbols of his mandate from heaven: his golden sword with its ruby-encrusted handle and his golden seal. Bao Dai became Citizen Vinh III, political advisor to the provisional government proclaimed by Ho Chi Minh on September 2nd, 1945. It was only a few days earlier than September 2nd that Ho Chi Minh had arrived in Hanoi. And he had arrived incognito. The guy was a complete nobody in Hanoi. Of course, everybody had heard of the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, but no one had ever seen him. Remember, unlike Mao Zedong, for example, Ho Chi Minh had spent his entire struggle out of the country. And that's why when he entered Hanoi on foot, sporting shorts and a colonial helmet, well, nobody noticed. For Ho Chi Minh, this was the first time in his life that he was setting foot in the capital. But his teams had done all the groundwork and everything was ready for the proclamation of the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So on September the 2nd, sporting a faded khaki jacket and rubber sandals, Ho Chi Minh stood up on Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi. He was surrounded by his lieutenants, who on the opposite were wearing white jackets and black ties. And I'm not sure if he did it on purpose or not, but Ho Chi Minh performed a magnificent example of what Cicero called captatio benevolentiae. That's Latin for winning of goodwill. When he began his speech, he just stopped after 1 minute and asked to the crowds, "My dear compatriots, can you hear me?" Remember, this is a guy from central Vietnam talking to northerners. And this is a guy as well who had been out of the country for 30 years, so his Vietnamese was maybe a bit rusty. But the crowd loved that. It roared in unison, "Yes, we can hear you." And from that moment on, he became Uncle Ho, and his cult began. The words he pronounced that day surprised the few Americans in the crowd. Quote, "All men are born equal. The Creator has given us certain inviolable rights, the right to life, to be free, and the right to happiness." End quote. These words were taken from the American Declaration of Independence, and Ho Chi Minh had written them with his confidant, the OSS Major Patty. Ho Chi Minh was still courting the Americans, and he wanted above all that the USA recognize his government in order to prevent the return of the French. And for that purpose, he did not even mention once the Soviet Union in his speech. To conclude, Ho Chi Minh asked the crowd to take an oath. Quote, "If France undertakes a civil war of reconquest, we swear not to enroll in its army, not to collaborate with France, not to sell food to its troops, not to serve as their guides." End quotes. France was the enemy now. And well, that was perfect timing because General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free France, had declared on August the 24th, quote, "France's position is very simple. France claims to regain its sovereignty over Indochina." End quote. So, at the very moment that Vietnamese people were drunk on freedom and independence and declared their freedom, France clearly stated its intention to reconquer its colony. So the stage was set for an inevitable confrontation. In the next episode, the battle will be on. And until then, take care and goodbye.
Namunya, nyawale ne jake.